This is the fifth and the last session, obviously, from the board. We've covered a lot of ground, starting with our roots, Jewish and Christian roots. We've considered the dimension of time through the year. We've also talked about worship as dialogue, and that's where we also got our hymnals out, and considered how hymns participate, or choral anthems participate in that dialogue, or lead us in that dialogue. We did the sacraments last week, and I really encourage you to do a little bit of looking around online, maybe, because that was the session in which I was the most cursory, I would say, about non-Presbyterian attitudes toward the sacraments. Nick, I don't know if you named for us, I think I named accurately all of the 7 sacraments of the Roman Catholic churches. And then Manfred was raised a Baptist, where baptism and communion were ordinances, not sacraments. Speak in terms of sacraments. And then it's very interesting that I think I may have mentioned this, but maybe not. John Wesley considered communion what he called a converting sacrament. So he welcomed anyone to the communion table because he believed that the actions of communion were as eloquent a preaching of the gospel as words. So I'll tell you where I may have also mentioned this from St. John's Presbyterian when I was a candidate. We had several adults who came from a group home, and the sermon was largely lost on them, and they would kind of wander in the aisles, some of them, and maybe chat and things. But when it was time for communion, they were absolutely focused. And every gesture of coming forward and receiving the bread and receiving the cup was riveting for those adults. So I believe they understood the gospel in a very visceral way, and that was their proclamation moment. So that's an interesting thing. Wesley's successors didn't retain that belief, and they made the table strictly for the believer. But Wesley saw it as that if one came to the table, Christ was drawing people to himself in the same way that Christ draws people through words and testimony and proclamation. So a few words about that. And now, from sanctuary to street, worship is open-ended. And that is the conviction of the Presbyterian Church, although maybe we haven't raised that up enough. So we're going to raise up that idea today, that worship is meant not to be, I'll just give you 2 words. The contrast between thinking of worship as an escape from the world or worship as an entry point into the world. And we're going to be emphasizing the latter. Worship as escape, worship as entry point into the world. Okay, so we'll get started. I like to think of it as crossing the gap between Sunday and Monday. Manfred noted that this sounds an awful lot like the last book you wrote. Yeah, it does. That was called Sunday's Sermon for Monday's World, Preaching to Shape Daring Wit. And I was interested in how can preaching better help turn people toward the world. And an important concept that's going to come up here is that a sermon, and we hear our preachers here do it, they reframe the world for us. So it is not an alien place, but it's the site of where God's ongoing redemptive work is unfolding. So a good sermon reframes the world for us. So it's a place we're drawn to, compelled to, with the love of Christ and with our confidence that God is up to something in the world, sometimes behind the scenes, underneath the appearances of the world. We believe that God is redemptively engaged in the world. And the preaching here does that again and again, and helps us see it as a place where God's promises are still being pursued and fulfilled. Okay, so Oops, I'm getting ahead of myself already. Okay, sometimes worship feels like a welcome escape from life's pressures, a chance to leave the world outside, still our minds, and center on what matters. We're going to have 2 breakout sessions, and the first one will come fairly soon, because what I don't want you to take away is that your personal experiences in worship and it's the insights it provides you, the therapeutic dynamic of worship that that heals wounds, that helps you deal with a past you can't change. Those dynamics of worship at a personal level, those are very important dynamics. And while I want to talk about how worship turns us toward the world, I don't want you to feel that I have just wiped off the slate any possibility that worship is a personally life-changing experience. So I believe that worship can and should create reflective and restorative space for us. If Presbyterians are a little short on one ingredient, I would say it's silence. We're not really good at silence. And you know, if you're up there as a worship leader, 30 seconds of silence feels like about 300 years. And it's, you know, really we're very stingy with reflective silence. Maybe we could use a bit more of it. So worship is meant to recenter and restore us. And I think it restores us and recenters us in our true God-given selves, the self that God is helping us to become, in a sense. We commune with a God who loves us infinitely, who accepts us fully, who in confession and assurance of pardon, proclamation, and hymns releases us from the bonds of guilt and regret, and restores us to perspective and hope. I imagine that you, at one time or another, have experienced those dynamics in worship when you needed those dynamics. And I feel strongly about this one, releasing us from the bonds of guilt and regret. When I was a pastor in the parish, people would come to see me and they'd be raking through some decision made in the past that they now deeply regret. And my advice to them often was, don't hold yourself hostage because God doesn't. You may have done the best you could with the emotions you experienced, with the opportunities you felt you had and didn't have. And you can't hold yourself hostage now in the light of knowledge you didn't have then to have done things differently. I think that can be a real toxin in a lot of our lives. And we hold ourselves hostage when God is not doing that. Okay, so those dynamics are very important. Worship strengthens us to face challenging circumstances and relationships. It reminds us whose we are and reconnects us. This is very important. Reconnects us to one another. I'll be saying a little more of that after this first short breakout discussion. But because of the dominant themes of individualism, autonomy, and every person for himself, herself, that is kind of baked into the American identity, we don't think of ourselves so much as we, as an interdependent body of many parts, and that none of us have to be sufficient to all things in and of ourselves, that we're able to do the work of God because we rely on each other, and not because each of us alone has to go out there and save the world. Certainly isn't our job. So we will be talking more about the communal aspect of worship after this. But this is what I'd like you to do. Take your hand out. In breakout session 1, I'll turn it to the back. And you'll see discussion questions. And I'll just read this. Tom Long, Presbyterian pastor and scholar, he was a mentor of mine, by the way, suggests that rather than saying blessed assurance, Jesus is mine, we might be better off singing blessed disturbance, we are his. Worship is meant to disrupt our self-centeredness, not reinforce it. But that said, at times we long for the blessed assurance that God knows our sufferings and our anxieties. So to the extent that you're willing, and you know, you can keep it on the surface if you're not being particularly safe about anything deep, don't necessarily know each other that well. I would say turn to one or two people next to you. I see, for instance, we have an odd number on the two twos, and where do we have? I would say if you two turn around and talk to each other, that'll work. And there's another two, somebody can see there. So get an eye on each other. Describe a time in your life when worship was a crucial source of personal reassurance, of healing, or of strength for a situation. I think one that's especially common in my generation is dealing with a crisis with aging parents. And the church can play an important role in helping us, first of all, not feel alone in those situations. And also maybe a resource for insight, for ideas, just to reinforce our patience. And it's a place sometimes just to shift the burden and have a couple of shoulders helping you carry it instead of carrying it alone. So that's the sort of thing that I have in mind. It may not be any more complex than that. So if you would turn to a partner and talk for a minute about, was there a time in your life when worship was a resource for strength, endurance, reassurance, whatever you needed at that moment?
Hi. I know you're still.
Other people I knew had theirs. Where I had to have and I was like, she's mother. But they were checking the station. Never had. And it just felt like
That's one sort of election I was. I thought. Because it was kind of nice seeing the.
How are you now? Getting along or
Still trust.
together forever? In a sense.
Yeah, well, you know, I have to do my
Yeah, right.
Okay. Found it.
Yeah, yeah, well,
You could tell.
no, I have my own. I got lucky.
Well said.
Oh, folks, if there's anyone who hasn't gotten a chance to say much yet, now would
My husband.
hello, online folks. I'll check in with you in a minute.
We had early 20s.
Say, I think we're gonna kind of wind it down. Obviously, these are conversations worth pursuing. Some of you may have found some common ground in this discussion. Is there anybody in the online group who wants to say a sentence or two about their own reflections on that question, a time when worship was an essential source of sustenance to you and your wife? Yeah, Nick.
Of course, like most people, I've had a couple of traumas in my life, but we'll keep this light, as you said, and not have to go into a deep psychoanalysis of things. Currently, I work full-time, 40-hour weeks at Home Depot, which has been quite an experience. You're dealing with a lot of different types of public. It's tough on my body. I'm 74 years old, and climbing ladders and lifting power tools is very difficult. And I found that it really helps me to pray every morning. It's become a necessity. I pray for patience and strength and to try to understand where the other person's coming from and I may have to deal with. I find daily prayer and really pushing to be as close to Jesus as I can every day really does give me strength, and it changes your whole outlook, your whole self-perception, gives you strength. It helps you when you really need it. And I couldn't live without it if I didn't have that closeness and that daily prayer.
Thank you. That's such a great testimony to that reframing dynamic. When we're oriented to the presence of God and the will and the ways of God, it shifts how we move into that next thing. And you don't go into it alone. That's part of the dynamic. Thank you very much. I hope that was productive for you. We were talking, each of us had lost a spouse several years ago. So that's a time when worship, sometimes you can't get through the worship very well. Singing the hymns gets really difficult, but that's sustaining. And it was for me, suddenly, and then my father died who had also been healthy, died 9 weeks after my husband in 2016. And that left me with no relatives anywhere in the state of Pennsylvania. and just some distant nephews in other states. So remembering whose I was, because you can't identify yourself anymore in relationship. Well, I'm married to this person and there's my dad. Those frameworks crumble, and then you have to reconstruct your sense of self, and worship is a great healer there. At the same time, now this is where we're going to get to. Every part of worship calls us back to our deepest commitments, and I'm just naming the ones that come to the top of my mind. Our commitment to God and to Christ, to significant others, and then to the welfare of neighbors and strangers who lack resources, opportunity, and caring relationships. So that becomes part of who we are. And immediately we're turned in our praying, I think in particular, toward the world, which is larger than our own concerns. Now, sometimes I think just getting up in the morning and maybe going to work and doing the job is most of what we can do. Although I imagine that Nick has rather a public ministry more than he may imagine when he handles a customer well. But it seems to me that God doesn't plan on keeping us safe from the world, because that is a warped human identity, not a fully human identity, because we do belong to each other. Worship is intended to reframe the everyday world. And to see the world as not empty of divine presence and concern, but precisely the place where God's redemptive work continues. The resurrection, we remember, how much the resurrection reframed worship, reframed Jewish worship for Christians. And that was the element, that was the shift in reality, the horizon of the new creation, born in the risen Jesus Christ. The resurrection wasn't the end of God's work, but the beginning of a new creation. And then our job is to participate. And participate out where it's tough. I'm limited to images in the public domain. So if not everyone absolutely seems to suit the moment, you'll forgive me. But as I think about how people are suffering in Ukraine, I thank God that God is still redemptively at work in those impossible places. But we forget sometimes how much our cultural context shapes worship. Here is a row of worshipers holding up rating signs for the sermon, for example, reflecting our tendency to be consumers of worship rather than giving ourselves over to worship. We shop.
Yeah.
And so, they're letting him know whether he's still at the top of the pile. He's doing pretty well. There's only 1-8. So and he says, I maybe should stop. I've got to ask the retired clergy to stop sitting together on the back row. And then he said, and then he's saying aloud, here ends the sermon. Anyway, so worship is meant to be relevant, okay? It should be relevant. Worship always happens. It comes to life in a cultural context. That's inevitable. In a language, an idiom that's accessible, right? You can't, and that was part of Vatican II. The Latin Mass, as familiar as it was not articulating meaning to people. And so it became the vernacular. So yes, we use recognizable language, musical idioms, forms of prayer and preaching. But now and then the scripture, the litanies, and especially the sermons can become challenging, and then we object. And then we hold up signs that say 5.3, 4.9, and consider, shopping down the street for a church who's not going to bring up these challenging things. So, but personally, well, Manfred and I have discussed this many times. I believe that public matters occupied Jesus more than private ones, or at least as much. He was always talking about the use and abuse of power that he saw going on around him. He messed with the religious authorities. He You know, he talked about that our first loyalty is not to Caesar, not to the realm. So he challenged people's ways of thinking for sure. What are some of our characteristically American ways of thinking about our lives and about our obligations? I've just made summaries here, and you may read these and say, not me so much. Americans tend to value rugged individualism in contrast, for example, to the African concept of Ubuntu. Has anybody encountered that term, Ubuntu? What it means is I am because we are. That's a rough translation of Ubuntu. I am because we are. So the we helps to create me as the individual. And I can't be myself without my ties, my relationships, and my tradition and my history. We tend to see ourselves in America first as autonomous agents and maybe only secondarily and voluntarily part of some larger whole. And that's why all that, holding up the signs and the ratings seem to matter, because we are autonomous agents. We're not going to stay in these pews just because this is where generations of our family have sat, because probably they didn't sit here, and we're here voluntarily, and we can walk out the door voluntarily. And that's a very American kind of attitude. It's no surprise that American Christianity therefore tends to emphasize personal relationship with Christ first and foremost. That isn't just a contemporary thing. In part, that comes out of the 19th century revivalist preachers and revivalist campaigns, particularly on the frontier. In the liturgical world, we call that the frontier tradition of hymnody and preaching, which press at the individual and sought for people to come down the sawdust aisle and confess their sin and name Christ as their savior. And those campaigns were all over the frontier. And the hymnody that came out of that is still in our hymn books. And that personalism is very much in our consciousness. Now, I'm not saying that that's unimportant, but we emphasize that it has been emphasized in American culture, disproportionate to the we and the communal nature of Christianity, far more than in cultures in Asia, Africa, or even parts of Europe, where a sense of a deep tradition that binds us together in a common worldview is much more strong. Individualism is also expressed in contemporary praise songs. Well, I think there's a lot of validity to the contemporization of worship and to the songwriting that went with it. My experience is that in that genre, first person singular pronouns, I, me, mine, dominate the rhetoric. Remember, we talked about the rhetoric of what we say in the dialogue of worship, so that there's a lot of talk about what God has done for me, how great God is to me, how generous God is to me, Jesus is mine. And that also comes out of that frontier tradition. It's maybe a contemporization of it. And there's a place for that, but now and then when I go to preach somewhere around here, and I know there's a contemporary service, I ask if they might throw in a couple that use we and us, because I'm going to be talking about we and us, and then I feel like, we get to the closing hymns and we're right back to, it's Jesus and me in my little personal sanctuary. So kind of undercuts the the effort, but sometimes I succeed, sometimes I don't. I'm not saying this is not important. I'm saying that it's not the whole story. Okay. Any thoughts or comments on it? Yes.
I don't know if this is real relevant to this, but it got me thinking. I am always uncomfortable singing the hymn, "They'll know we are Christians by our love." Because we haven't cornered the market on love.
Mhm.
I mean, human beings can love.
Mhm.
We love because of a particular faith that we have.
Yeah.
But it doesn't seem right for us to claim that as unique.
Yeah.
And I've always been uncomfortable. I refuse to sing.
Yeah, they just sort of invoke the word in a sort of floaty way. Well, it came out of the, what, 60s?
Yeah.
It came out of the, the love fest of the
Yeah.
60s. And the love fest was in the church as well. Yeah.
Plus to add on to that, there's a lot of stuff we did as Christians that was not so good,
Yes,
a lot,
there's a lot of history there.
right?
That would be an interesting course, wouldn't it? Get a church historian in here to talk about where Christians,
How do you do that stuff?
in the name of God, did
Uh-huh.
some things. Let me get John and then we'll get Nick. Go ahead. Yeah.
You mentioned render under Caesar. I've heard Christians, even in the church, use that expression to justify or to ignore our own sin. For example, the invasion of Iraq in which we killed over 1 million people for what? Based on a lie. Could you comment on render under Caesar? I never.
Well, I think that'd be a long discussion, so I'll try to be brief, but Jesus, it's interesting that Jesus, in that he has a coin and he shows them the coin, and what is on a coin in the Roman Empire is the head of Caesar. He says, render to Caesar what is Caesar's. The question was paying taxes, and you give him that coin. But Jesus implies that you render to God whatever bears the image of God. What bears the image of God? Every human being. So, so Caesar gets his due, but primary is the welfare of every human being, the image bearers of God versus the image bearer. That's a shorthand way of thinking about that. Yeah, Sue. Oh, I did tell Nick he was next in the queue, so I'll come right back to you. Nick, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I want to make a point, and I'm certainly willing to have pushback on this, but I think Martin Luther, to some degree, really reinforced the whole idea of individualism. That his whole basic concept that you don't need a priest anymore, even though he was a priest, and getting rid of indulgences and all the things that his thesis comprised, in a way was saying that you can get to God directly. Individualism does count. Certainly his thoughts, when he took on a whole gigantic institution with his thoughts. I mean, I think the idea of individualism isn't just necessarily an American concept, it's certainly European, and it's also something that's been emphasized by Protestants as well as Catholics.
Yeah, I do think it's been especially sort of almost sacralized, though, in the American context, because just of our Constitution. And I think you're right. It grows out of that Protestant impulse to deliver the faith of the individual from the magisterium of the Roman Catholic Church. Good point. Yeah, Sue.
So much is being said here, in my studies in the Old Testament, I think that one could argue that God is very much concerned for the individual, but also for humankind and community, and for communities, plural. And so I think that New Testament expert might chime in, but I would think that the New Testament also, the letters and what have you, are emphasizing community.
Yes.
And yet it's not like the individual's lost to the shuffle. God's so concerned each baby baptized, but also in community. So I think that balance is there in the scripture. And when we're in worship, I think the balance is vital.
Yes, that's well said. And it's and then I also think about those baptisms we were talking about that are in Acts 16 of the jailer and his whole household, Lydia and her household. So it's the individual lifted up among that community that nourishes the individual and that she or he nourishes. So
Sally,
yeah.
just one comment. In the social national context, our founding document, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A similar phrase in the Canadian Foundation document is life, liberty, and the pursuit of the common good.
That's
And
an
the common
interesting
good
difference.
does not leave out the individual,
Uh-huh.
because we know we are part of each other.
Yeah. But when my happiness, when it's a
He's
difference
make-
between your happiness and my happiness. Yeah, Nick, and then
I just wanted to say,
the last
he just,
commenter, okay?
yeah, he just made an excellent point, though. The pursuit of happiness really becomes a very individual thing. What's happiness to one person is different from another. Hannah Arendt wrote a book on the revolution. And in one of her main points, it's that individualism that causes revolutions. It's that willing, as you said, to take on the magisterium of the power of the authority. But that part of pursuit of happiness is really a very individual pursuit.
Well, this discussion could just go on for a very long time, but I'm watching the clock and I have more slides and I really want to. So thank you, everyone. That was an excellent discussion. Relevant worship, therefore, is not necessarily comfortable worship. When relevance means keeping worship strictly personal, it can be domesticated. Domesticated worship blesses the status quo, avoids the challenging otherness of God's world, and keeps Christian life relatively risk-free. I've been there. I mean, I have worshiped in spaces where that was it. And when it became uncomfortable for anyone, then we kept it comfortable again, sort of pulled in. Now, I don't know if you can see what's happening here. I couldn't fit the whole painting. Jesus is at the house of a Pharisee, and this is the woman anointing his feet, which was utterly shocking and inappropriate. There was, this is the kind of thing that Jesus did that made him so dangerous in the eyes of the religious establishment, that he says, she has anointed me for my burial. What she has done will be remembered.
Why was that considered dangerous?
Pardon?
Why was that dangerous?
Because she's probably a prostitute, and they would come into the houses and more or less, trying to attract attention. She comes in and anoints the feet of Jesus. To be touched by a woman was out of the question in Jewish culture at the time. No self-respecting religious Jew would allow a woman to touch him in that way. So I think that worship is trying to change the subject a bit for us by the time we move to the end of it. Worship restores us, but it also decenters us from ourselves enough to recenter us in God's passions for the world. So worship has a dynamic of restoring us to our true vocation. I like to talk about us this way: God's active agents of tangible hope for those who are broken, without options, and without hope. We are God's active agents of tangible hope for those who are broken, without options, and without hope. So that's part of who we are. This is the part of ourselves that we tend to be a bit less attentive to, perhaps, if we ourselves are fairly comfortable. Okay, so it's about a lot more than our personal spiritual development. I know to even put the word refugee on a slide is to sow discontent, but for some. But I think worship is intended to reframe our perception of the world. It's also meant to ignite our imagination. And I really like the way that preachers here put skin on it, so to speak. A friend of mine had a little sister who was very distressed one night. She was afraid there were monsters under her bed. So Sandy, my friend, went in and said, "It's okay. Jesus is with you." There was a silence, and her little sister said, "I need somebody with skin on." So it's our preachers try to tell us a story, give us a narrative, point a direction, tell us a story of something going on in the world that is changing lives, so that hope is tangible. And you don't just end the sermon with a bunch of big abstract nouns about justice and this and that and the other thing. There's someone, there's a person, there's a life, there's a situation to help us think imaginatively about what our role as agents of redemptive hope might be. And then it wants to move us into the world ready to put action behind our prayers. Maybe that's the whole point today is how does worship kind of tee us up to move into the world and put action behind the prayers we just prayed. So prayers in scripture, proclamation, creed, reframe the world so we see it as God does. Beloved, and a site for restorative justice. We talked about the sacraments. Baptism reminds us who we are, God's claim upon us, that we're participants with God. We don't go out there and bring God to a godless world. Although that was the way I was taught when I was young, that the world was godless and we had to get out there. If we didn't get out there, there's no God in the world. I believe God is up to something in the world. The Holy Spirit is already working in the world. We got to get out there and discern it and participate in some strand of it. Not everything, just find your strand, find your narrative, your storyline to follow into the world. And then the Lord's Supper makes us one with Christ in the community of faith. That's incorporated into nearly every Eucharistic prayer. Make us one with Christ and with all who call upon your name. And then we're the companions of one another and in a sense of God to get about God's work in the world. So the sacraments have that restorative, but also sending dynamic to them. So God-centered worship doesn't shield us from the world, it sends us into the world. God's passions become ours, and we turn to the world seeing it differently through this lens of God's compassion and hope. We become agents of hope. I love this line. I did an address for one of the convocations at Princeton, and I had been very much struck by the declaration in the Roman Catholic Church of the Year of Mercy. Do you remember that? And I would drive, I had a commute that I made between a home that my late husband and I had over here in Pennsylvania and my faculty residence. And my route took me past a small Catholic parish with a huge banner with that one big word displayed on it, mercy. So I really dove into what were the documents and the papal declarations around this Year of Mercy. And I loved this line. Worship challenges our fear of entering into the chaos of another. Pope Francis sought to relate mercy to justice. Now, justice we can think of maybe as a little more about the structures that create either opportunity or oppression for people in various situations. Mercy gets down and gets its hands dirty. And in that convocation thing, because we had a lot of students, they were all about justice, but a lot of them are about justice on their couch, tweeting something on their computer. That's a pretty safe place to announce yourself for justice. Pope Francis said we need people who are willing to get out there where it's messy and complex, and you can't always get it right. And it feels like you have just stepped into a chaotic swirl of issues. Maybe some of you have had that experience in trying to maybe be part of a ministry to homeless people, or maybe you've been a visitor to a prison, doing prison worship, that sort of thing. And when you start to hear some of these stories, you feel like you have dived into chaos, a chaotic set of factors and problems. But mercy risks going there. according to Pope Francis. We're restored to be restorers. We're healed to be agents of healing. So essentially that for me connects the personal restoration, healing, hope, strength, correction of vision, clarity that comes to us, and our role out there. It's just that out there is overwhelmingly large, right? So that's enough to just make you go home and read a good book. I think the temptation is to read books about what it might be like to be at risk in the world, but maybe not to get out there. And we all have to start somewhere, and it can be small. It can be small. I have a friend who regularly shows up at a clothing bank and helps to sort the clothes. And then on occasion, she's there to help the customers who come to the clothing bank. And that is for her, it's a step into a very different experience of life, where she has to, be face to face with people quite different from herself, with very different opportunities, and perhaps very, very much less hope. So I think it's not so much to do something grand as to do something. And I wrestle with this all the time. In this season, I bet you're all having experience, both Manfred and I have talked about, you open your mailbox, and what percentage of your mail is asking you for a check?
Yeah.
80%. Yeah, that's probably a good guess. Yeah, 80%. And it's just overwhelming. You just want to just recycle the whole thing. I confessed in one sermon not too long ago that what I tend to do is I leave it on the kitchen counter, hoping that if it marinates for a while, this will be clearer. But it too often it immobilizes me instead of mobilizing. Let's go to, first of all, if there are any questions or comments, but then let's go to breakout 2, which is on the back of your sheet. First, any particular questions or comments on this? Maybe better to just talk with each other. There are 2 questions, and you may feel more drawn to one than the other. Worship does not end with a benediction. True worship extends to active participation in God's deep concern with society's most needy and most vulnerable. How does worship on Sunday help you decenter from self-absorbed concerns and recenter so you envision and play your role in bringing God's loving justice to situations in this area? Or maybe there's just been a time when you felt recentered. You could get over yourself for a minute and felt a real longing to be involved. Everyday pressures often distract us from our role as God's active agents of hope. Now, some of us are fortunate to be doing volunteering or possibly working in a way and in a context that is doing this. I was fortunate enough to do that. I mean, I saw training preachers as a way of shifting perception out there in the world and opening doors into the world. How could you help each other? How do we help each other turn our good intentions into sustained actions? That may be a more, that might have more traction for you right now than the other one. But I would say turn to the same neighbor and just talk about how do you feel about this aspect of being turned toward the world, and what are maybe the stoppers, and how could we help? Okay, let's give it 5 minutes or so.
I came back afterwards. Guidance, reflections that help
both.
Oh, good for you.
Yeah, and so I mean, stuff finding out.
And then,
Okay, well, there you go. But I just have one.
and so at the end of it, it's okay to say, I've done that. There's some people they don't do this program anymore, they're, and they, start to find that pretty important. But I found it sometimes and other, yeah, and I think that's perfectly okay. And, my I actually told him I had because he would go out of town on Monday. And he had a 10-year it was like, Christmas Eve in their house was like all together. All their friends. I could see we have kids at home. I think the church as a whole is good. Maybe we can, we can only have that one shot to create whatever memory you're out there.
The way we work in
yeah.
So, I was always gonna walk
Yeah, I mean, I work around what people want to do. I don't think you have to do every day. And even with the donation, and then we kind of felt that for every nothing lost. Straight up. You're not just raising money, but you're providing Community warehouse. Well, I had to take pictures with them. Like, and then they run it, so like, no, they don't. Yeah, oh, okay, so I got another week. Oh my gosh.
So I breathe kind of like my
Yeah. I think the church could do a better job of inviting more. We have those church that when you join, they got a call. And you are more attached to the church. I think it makes knowing other people and you and your college. That's how you get each other. You have to choose to make yourself. That's an easy. No, I think in every phase of life, we should.
I hate to interrupt, but here I'm doing it. Okay, folks, I'm a little far from the light switch. If you were my class, I'd be over in the corner watching the lights like it's a theater. That's the only way I could really get them out of the It sounds like you had some good conversations, and Manfred and I were saying, partly, academics have a tendency to be interested. So I think we're going to work a little harder at, so what are you doing? Telling the other one, let's go get out there and, just get out there and be more extroverted in the name of God's redemptive hope. Yes.
I was just going to say that one of the great things about this church is there's so many opportunities to get out there and help.
Yeah. This church helps you get out there. You just have to pop your head up above the anonymity level. I served in a big church like this one, and there were people who were just there because they could be anonymous. But there just comes a point, I think, where the Spirit kind of nudges you and says, okay, we've solved a lot of these problems. This is the time to, look up out of your little foxhole and say, I'm here, and I'm here for Christ, and I'm here for Christ in the world. And another way I think that churches can be helpful, and this may already have been done here, we created a volunteer notebook. And it was split into different areas of the church, like youth or ministry with older adults or ministry of the homeless or education or whatever it was. And then we, in order of sort of the level of time commitment, we tried to identify things that even the busiest person could do. That maybe it would take an hour a month. And here's the person to whom you'd be accountable. This is the difference that your participation makes in this area of ministry. And then that was all the way up to major kind of commitments, chairs of committees or task groups or whatever, with much larger time commitments. And we always made sure that there was honorable retirement from volunteerism. I think one of our fears is, we say to, lovely Mrs. Smith after 37 years, and she's now 87, what? You're not going to teach the 3-year-olds anymore? I mean, and then we shame her for her 37 years. So there always has to be an honorable exit, and you may find that kind of ministry does not suit you. And you need to bring it to a close and find something more suited to your time or your flexibility or whatever.
You're absolutely
Yeah.
right about everything you're saying, and I totally agree with you. One of the issues we're having right now, if you look around this room, you see anybody under 50? We're having a real time finding this group of youngsters, okay?
Mhm.
And we've all, yes, we've raised our children, we've done all these things, and blah, blah, blah. But still, a lot of you were participants in your younger years. You didn't just all of a sudden, when you retired, decide to do this. You've all been active, and that's what we really need in our church right now. Let me tell you,
Yeah.
to find these younger ones and find a way for them to
Mhm.
engage with us. This is hugely important.
Where are they?
Well, that's the point. And they excuse themselves for various reasons, but we need to, yes, sports, all, music lessons, all that. We need to find a way to engage them because that's the future. We're not the future. They are.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's a challenge. Well, thank you. This has been delightful to explore all of this with you. I hope that the PowerPoints, have been somewhat helpful in the handout. And I will say that Jenny and our musician Tim and I are talking about some kind of shape of doing something with music and worship and just enlarge that part of our understanding of worship. Don't know how that'll take shape or when, but Tim's willing. Actually, he wrote me, so we're cooking something. Anyway, thank you for all your attentiveness. I wish you a very blessed